My English teacher made us sign contracts for total silence in class, then gave me detention for whispering to help a kid having a panic attack while she graded papers. What teacher made you hate school? Mrs. Harrison ran her English class like a monastery where she was the only one allowed to speak. She had this theory that teenagers couldn't actually learn while talking because their brains were too underdeveloped to multitask, which she'd read in some outdated education journal from the 90s. Even during group projects, we had to communicate through written notes passed silently between desks. She'd installed this app on her phone that measured decibel levels, and if it went above a whisper, she'd slam her hand on her desk and restart whatever assignment we were doing from the beginning. On day 1, she made us sign contracts stating we understood that any verbal communication would result in immediate detention and a call home. She literally gave a kid detention for sneezing too loudly once, saying he did it for attention. Her class was torture for everyone, but especially for kids who learned by talking through problems. We'd sit there for 50 minutes in dead silence, not even allowed to ask questions unless we wrote them on index cards and waited for her to collect them at the end of class. Partner work meant sitting next to someone and sliding papers back and forth like we were prisoners passing contraband. She had this whole system where we used different colored pens to show who wrote what, and she'd check to make sure both partners contributed equally without speaking. Kids started failing her class not because they didn't know the material, but because they couldn't figure out what she wanted without being able to ask. The guidance counselor got so many complaints that they tried to observe her class, but Mrs. Harrison just said it was an innovative teaching method that prepared us for standardized testing conditions. I figured out pretty quickly that if you knew how to control your volume, you could whisper barely loud enough for someone next to you to hear without triggering her decibel app. I'd practiced with my friend Jade during lunch, learning exactly how quiet we had to be. It was risky because Ms. Harrison would randomly patrol the room, but sometimes you had to communicate to survive her insane assignments. She also had this old camera in the corner that she claimed was just for security, but we all suspected she watched the footage to catch rule breakers. We were doing peer reviews on our essays about symbolism in The Great Gatsby, which meant 40 minutes of silent paper exchanges while Ms. Harrison sat at her desk grading papers from another class. I was paired with Aiden, this quiet kid who always sat in the back and never caused problems. About 10 minutes into the review, I noticed his hands were shaking as he tried to write feedback on my essay. His breathing was getting faster and shorter, and he kept touching his chest like he couldn't get enough air. I recognized what was happening because my sister had panic attacks. Aiden's eyes were huge and terrified, and he was starting to hyperventilate but trying to stay quiet because making noise would mean detention. He grabbed his throat like he was choking, and tears started rolling down his face. Mrs. Harrison was completely oblivious, humming to herself while highlighting something on her papers. Other kids noticed something was wrong, but nobody knew what to do, and Aiden was spiraling fast. I made the choice knowing exactly what I was risking. I leaned over and whispered as quietly as I could that he was having a panic attack and it would pass. I told him to breathe with me, counting to 4 on the inhale and 6 on the exhale. I kept my voice below the app's threshold, just barely loud enough for him to hear. I talked him through grounding techniques, telling him to name 5 things he could see, 4 he could touch, 3 he could hear. My voice was steady and calm even though my heart was racing because I knew I was breaking the cardinal rule. It took almost 10 minutes of constant whispered coaching, but his breathing finally slowed and his hands stopped shaking. He nodded at me, mouthing thank you, as the color came back to his face. Ms. Harrison never looked up once. When class ended, Aiden practically ran out, still shaky, but okay. I thought we'd gotten away with it. The next morning, Mr. Harrison was standing at the front of the room with her laptop connected to the smartboard, smiling like she'd won the lottery. The classroom camera feed was paused on the screen, showing yesterday's class from an angle I didn't even know existed. Before we begin today's lesson, she said, clicking play on the video, I want to share something interesting I discovered while reviewing our classroom recordings for my teaching portfolio. The video showed me leaning toward Aiden, and she turned up the volume until you could hear my whispered voice clearly through the speakers, counting breaths and listing grounding techniques. Can anyone tell me what rule is being broken here? Nobody raised their hand, and the room stayed dead quiet, except for the ticking clock above the whiteboard. My face got hot, and I stared at my desk while a couple kids shifted in their seats, making the plastic squeak. Aiden looked like he was about to puke and kept wiping his hands on his jeans over and over. Ms. Harrison waited another 10 seconds before clicking her tongue and shaking her head like we'd all failed some test. Verbal communication during silent work time, she said, walking to her desk and pulling out her detention pad. She wrote my name at the top in big letters and held it up so everyone could see. Detention today at 3:15, and I'll be calling your parents to discuss this violation of our classroom contract. She typed something on her computer, and I knew she was updating my participation grade right there in front of everyone. This will be reflected in your quarterly assessment as well. She clicked off the video and went back to teaching about metaphors in chapter 7, like she hadn't just humiliated me for helping someone who couldn't breathe. The rest of class crawled by with everyone too scared to even turn pages too loud. When the bell finally rang, I caught Jade's eye, and she gave me this tiny nod that said she thought what happened was messed up. Aiden rushed past me in the hallway and whispered, "Thank you," so quiet I barely heard it before he disappeared into the crowd of kids heading to 6th period. I wanted to catch up to him, but knew that would just make things worse for both of us. I waited for everyone to leave and tried to talk to Ms. Harrison about what really happened. She didn't even look up from organizing her papers when I started explaining about the panic attack. The rules are very clear, she said, pointing at the contract taped to her bulletin board with all our signatures on it. No exceptions means no exceptions. She smiled this cold smile and reminded me detention started at 3:15 sharp, and being late would mean another one tomorrow. At lunch, Jade and I found a corner table in the cafeteria away from everyone else. She She had audio on that camera the whole time, Jade said, stabbing her chicken nuggets with her fork. That's so messed up. You were literally saving him from a medical emergency. She told me I did the right thing, but warned me not to push back too hard since Ms. Harrison controlled our English grades, and we both needed them for honor roll. That afternoon, I sat in detention with 3 other kids in this silent room that smelled like old carpet. The monitor was reading some magazine about fishing and didn't even look at us once. I spent the whole hour thinking about whether I should report this to someone, but kept coming back to how Ms. Harrison always got away with everything. When I got home, my mom was waiting with her phone in her hand after getting the automated call from the school. What happened? She asked, and I told her everything about Aiden not being able to breathe and the hidden audio recording. She got this look on her face like she was proud of me for helping, but also frustrated I got in trouble. We need to think about this carefully, she said, because she knew how teachers could make things hard for students who complained. The next morning, I went to the guidance office before first period and asked to see Amara Pierce since she was the counselor who dealt with Mrs. Harrison complaints before. The secretary said her first opening was Thursday afternoon, which felt like forever when I had to go back to that classroom today. I spent all of third and fourth period with this knot in my stomach thinking about fifth period English. When I walked into Ms. Harrison's room, she had her phone propped up on her desk with the decibel app already running. Class, I've adjusted our noise threshold for an even more productive learning environment, she announced, and the number on the screen was lower than I'd ever seen it. Everyone sat frozen in their seats, scared to even breathe too heavy, and I noticed she kept looking at me with this satisfied expression every few minutes. The whole period felt even worse than before, with kids holding in coughs and trying not to let their pencils scratch too loud on paper. After class, I pulled Jade aside by her locker and asked if she'd write down what she saw with Aiden's panic attack. Yeah, I'll write something, she said, but then asked me not to mention we practiced whispering at lunch because she couldn't risk getting on Ms. Harrison's bad side with college applications coming up. I told her I understood, but it made me feel more alone in this whole thing. The meeting with Amara Pierce came 2 days later in her tiny office next to the main office. She had papers spread across her desk and a legal pad ready when I walked in. I sat in the squeaky chair across from her and started from the beginning with Aiden's panic attack. I described his shaking hands and how he couldn't breathe and the tears on his face. Ms. Harrison measuring silence with a decibel app while a kid literally can't breathe is peak. I care more about rules than humans' energy. Someone should tell her teaching isn't supposed to be a game of library prison warden. She wrote everything down without interrupting once. When I got to the part about the camera having audio that nobody knew about, her pen stopped moving. She looked up at me with her eyebrows raised. The contracts we signed didn't mention audio recording, I said. She made a note and underlined it twice. She asked me to write a formal statement about everything that happened. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and typed for 2 hours straight. I included every detail about Aiden touching his chest and hyperventilating. I explained the grounding techniques I used and why I had to whisper to help him. I mentioned how the audio capability wasn't disclosed to students or parents. My hands shook a little as I attached the document to an email and hit send. The next morning, I got called out of first period for a meeting with Aide Proctor, the assistant principal. His office smelled like coffee and old books. He had my statement printed out on his desk with yellow highlights all over it. He told me the detention would stand for now, but they were reviewing the classroom recording policies. His tone was neutral, but he kept tapping his pen on the desk while he talked. He said they'd investigate further and get back to me. During my free period, I went to the library and pulled up the student handbook on one of the computers. I searched for anything about classroom surveillance and recording policies. The language was super vague about cameras being allowed for security purposes. There was nothing specific about audio recording at all. I took screenshots of every page that might be relevant and saved them to my Google Drive. By lunch the next day, word had spread that I got in trouble for helping Aiden during his panic attack. Kids kept coming up to me in the hallway saying they thought what I did was right. But when I asked if anyone would write a statement supporting me, they all looked away and mumbled excuses. Nobody wanted to risk getting on Ms. Harrison's bad side. The social dynamics felt weird and tense. People would whisper when they saw me, but stop talking when I got close. The next English class, Ms. Harrison announced she was rearranging the seating chart for better classroom management. She moved me from my spot near Aiden and Jade to the front corner by the door. She called it a routine change, but everyone knew it was about me. Now I sat isolated where she could watch me constantly from her desk. The message was crystal clear. At lunch 2 days later, Whale Preston from the student newspaper found me eating alone by the vending machines. He sat down without asking and pulled out his phone to record. I want to write about classroom privacy and surveillance, he said quietly. He thought it was an important issue, but warned me the advisor might not approve anything that singled out a specific teacher. I gave him the basic facts about the audio recording, but asked him not to use names yet. He nodded and put his phone away. After school that same day, Aiden caught up with me at the bike racks. He looked around to make sure nobody was watching before he started talking. I've had panic attacks before, but never in class, he said. He explained how scared he was of being labeled as weak or problematic by teachers. He was grateful I helped when nobody else would, but he wouldn't file a complaint because he didn't want the attention. I told him I understood and watched him pedal away quickly. That night, I got an email from Amara saying she'd elevated the audio recording concern to district technology staff for review. She'd also reached out to the school nurse about creating an accommodation plan for students with anxiety issues. The plan would allow brief verbal check-ins during medical episodes. It was progress, but it felt super slow. The whole process seemed designed to take forever. 3 days later in English class, someone in the back row knocked their textbook off their desk. It hit the floor with a loud thud, and Ms. Harrison's decibel app went crazy. She stood up and announced we were starting the entire assignment over from the beginning. We'd been working for 30 minutes already on essay revision. decisions. The collective groan was silent, but you could feel the frustration radiating through the room. Kids were shooting angry looks at her when she turned to write on the board. One girl actually crumpled up her paper before smoothing it out again. The resentment in that classroom was getting thicker every single day. 2 days later, Aide Proctor showed up at our classroom door right before the bell rang. He smiled at Mrs. Harrison and said it was just a routine observation for his records. She nodded and straightened her papers while we all exchanged knowing looks. The whole class period turned into a performance where she actually let kids raise their hands to ask questions. She walked around the room helping students instead of sitting at her desk. She even smiled when someone dropped their textbook, saying accidents happen to everyone. Between her helpful comments, she kept mentioning how outside scrutiny could disrupt the learning environment. She talked about how some people didn't understand innovative teaching methods. Every nice thing she did came with a little dig at whoever had complained about her. When the bell rang and Aide left, she went right back to her silent classroom rules. That night, I checked the online grade portal before bed and saw my participation grade had dropped from a B to a C. The comment section said, disruptive behavior patterns, which made my stomach drop. My mom saw it on her phone app within minutes and immediately called the school's main office. The secretary told her grade disputes had to go through a formal review process that could take weeks. She had to fill out 3 different forms and submit them to the academic committee for review. The whole system seemed designed to make parents give up before getting anywhere. The next morning, I saw Aiden walking toward the nurse's office with a hall pass. Later, Jade told me Nurse Kemi had pulled him aside after getting some kind of referral from the counselor's office. Aiden came back to class looking calmer than I'd seen him in weeks. He had this little yellow card in his pocket that he kept touching like it was protecting him. During lunch, Whale found me by my locker looking frustrated about something. He told me the newspaper advisor had shot down his story idea about classroom surveillance. The advisor said it was too controversial and could seem like they were targeting a specific teacher. Whale said he might try pitching something broader about student privacy rights without naming names. The school was protecting itself by shutting down any criticism before it could spread. Over the next few days, different classmates started pulling me aside between classes or texting me at night. They all had their own Ms. Harrison horror stories, but nobody wanted to file official complaints. One girl was worried about her college recommendation letters since Ms. Harrison taught AP English too. A guy from 3rd period said his parents would kill him if his GPA dropped over, causing trouble. Everyone was scared of the consequences of speaking up, which I totally understood. Being the one who complained publicly had already cost me a letter grade, and who knew what else. I heard from another teacher that Amara had sent Mrs. Harrison a formal memo about medical accommodations. The memo suggested implementing a tap-out card system for students experiencing medical distress. It mentioned allowing brief verbal check-ins during health emergencies and copied Aide Proctor on everything. Ms. Harrison hadn't responded to the memo yet, according to the office gossip. During our next class, I noticed Ms. Harrison had started doing something new with her phone. She would walk around the room holding it close to her mouth and speaking really quietly into it. She was making voice recordings of her observations about what students were doing. Everyone pretended not to notice, but we all knew she was building her own evidence since the camera thing was under review. She would pause by certain desks and whisper notes about their work or behavior. It felt like she was documenting everything to use against us later if needed. Things got worse when Jade tried to borrow a pencil from the girl next to her. She whispered as quietly as possible, but the decibel app still caught it and started beeping. Ms. Harrison gave her detention immediately without even asking what happened. That night, Jade texted me saying she couldn't afford any more problems with her GPA on the line. She asked me to understand if she kept her distance in class from now on. Our friendship was getting strained because of this whole situation, and it hurt. My mom had reached her limit after seeing the participation grade and hearing about Jade's detention. She called the school and demanded a meeting with administration about the classroom environment. The secretary scheduled it for the following week and said Aide Proctor, Amara, and Ms. Harrison would all attend. The official confrontation was finally happening, but I felt sick thinking about sitting in a room with all of them. I spent that whole weekend getting ready for the meeting and organizing everything I had. I made a timeline of every incident starting from the first day of class. I printed out screenshots of my grade drops and the comments about disruptive behavior. I practiced explaining everything calmly, even though I was furious about how she was treating everyone. My main goals were getting the audio recording stopped completely and creating real emergency exceptions. I also wanted that participation penalty reversed since I hadn't actually disrupted anything. I went over my notes again and again, trying to prepare for whatever Ms. Harrison might say. 3 days before the meeting, I sat in Ms. Harrison's silent classroom and wrote my question on an index card. I asked if whispers during medical emergencies were now allowed since someone could die waiting for written permission. Ms. Harrison making secret voice notes about students while investigating her own secret recordings is peak. I'll show them who's really watching who energy. Someone should tell her that's not how trust works in classrooms. Ms. Harrison picked up my card during collection time, read it, and set it aside without looking at me. She told the class all questions would be addressed at the end like always. The bell rang before she got to mine, and she packed up her papers like nothing had happened. I saw Aiden in the hallway after school talking to Amara near the counseling office. He kept his voice low and his hands were shaking a little as he handed her some papers. Later, Amara told me he'd written a statement about his panic attack, but couldn't handle being at the meeting. She said his privacy would be protected, but his statement would help show what really happened. He looked guilty when he walked away, like he was letting me down by not being there. The next morning during homeroom, our principal came on the announcements with a district technology memo. He read that all classroom audio recording required written parental consent and had to be disclosed at the start of each year. Teachers with recording devices had to stop using them immediately and delete any stored files from personal devices. When I got to English class, Ms. Harrison was reading a printed copy copy of the memo at her desk. Her face was turning red and her jaw was clenched, so tight I could see the muscles moving. She folded the paper and shoved it in her desk drawer, then started class like nothing had changed. 2 days later, she announced we'd be doing pop writing quizzes to check our focus. Every 10 minutes, she'd stop teaching and we had to write what we were just thinking about on special blue cards. She said it would help her understand if we were really paying attention to the material. The cards had numbers on them that matched our seat assignments, so she'd know who wrote what. It felt like she was trying to get inside our heads since she couldn't listen to us anymore. During lunch that same day, my history teacher pulled me aside in the hallway. She said what I did for Aiden took courage and Ms. Harrison's methods were way too extreme. But then she looked around and said she couldn't say that publicly because of teacher solidarity rules. My science teacher said something similar after class, mentioning union politics and professional courtesy. Their support meant nothing if they wouldn't actually speak up when it mattered. That afternoon, Nurse Kemi stopped by my locker with a yellow folder. She showed me a new medical protocol she'd created for classroom panic attacks. It included tap-out cards students could silently hold up, a breathing minute in the hallway, and automatic nurse passes. She'd gotten it approved as a standard accommodation that any teacher had to honor no matter what. The protocol removed teacher discretion completely when it came to medical situations. It wasn't perfect, but at least future kids like Aiden would have an escape route. The night before the meeting, my phone buzzed with a text from Jade. She said her parents were mad about her grades dropping and she couldn't risk more trouble. She'd written a short statement saying she saw Aiden's panic attack but kept it basic and factual. She didn't mention our friendship or how we'd practiced whisper volumes together at lunch. I texted back that I understood even though my chest felt tight reading her message. The next morning, my mom drove me to the school early for the meeting in Aide Proctor's office. We sat in the leather chairs facing his desk while he organized papers and checked his watch. Amara arrived next with a thick folder and her laptop, followed by Whale Preston from the district office. Ms. Harrison came in last, carrying her gradebook and a folder stuffed with printed emails. She sat down without making eye contact with anyone and started arranging her papers on her lap. The air in the room felt heavy, and nobody talked while we waited for Aide to start. He cleared his throat and pulled up something on his computer screen. He said the district had reviewed the situation and found that recording students without consent violated policy. Ms. Harrison interrupted to say she was documenting teaching methods for her professional development portfolio. Aide shook his head and said intent didn't matter because the policy was clear about consent. She had to stop all recording immediately and couldn't use any footage she'd already collected. Her fingers gripped her folder so tight the edges were bending. When Aide brought up Aiden's panic attack, Mrs. Harrison said she hadn't noticed because she was focused on grading. She claimed she trusted students to advocate for themselves if they needed help. My mom's voice was sharp when she pointed out that was impossible when talking was completely banned. Amara added that teachers had a legal duty to respond to medical emergencies regardless of classroom rules. Ms. Harrison's jaw tightened and she stared at her gradebook without responding. Aide cleared his throat and looked between all of us before opening a folder on his desk. He ran his finger down a page of notes and said the detention would stand since I did break the posted rule, but he'd reduce the participation penalty to 5% instead of 20%. My mom started to argue, but Aide held up his hand and explained this was the best compromise given the circumstances. Ms. Harrison's fingers gripped her pen so tight I thought it might snap. Amara wrote something on her legal pad while Aide outlined the new protocols that would start immediately. Every classroom had to provide tap-out cards for students who needed to step outside for anxiety or medical issues. Teachers had to allow brief whispers for health concerns directed to them, not other students. The decibel app threshold had to be raised to normal conversation level, not whisper level. Ms. Harrison's face got redder with each new rule, but she kept her mouth shut and scribbled notes about maintaining academic standards. Nobody looked happy when we left, but at least something had changed. The next morning, I walked into English class and saw 3 yellow index cards sitting on Ms. Harrison's desk, labeled TAPOUT in black marker. She didn't look at me when I sat down, but I noticed her phone wasn't running the decibel app anymore. The room still felt tense and cold, but when someone coughed, nobody flinched, waiting for detention threats. After class, Ms. Harrison called me to her desk and slid a paper across to me without making eye contact. It was an extra credit assignment to write a 5-page research paper on classroom management techniques due in 2 weeks. The topic felt like a trap, but I needed those grade points, so I took the paper and nodded. That weekend, I spent 6 hours at the library pulling articles about collaborative learning and anxiety accommodation in educational settings. I had to be careful not to directly criticize her methods, so I focused on general research findings and positive examples from other schools. Every sentence took forever, because I kept second-guessing whether it sounded too pointed or aggressive. I cited 12 sources and made sure to include some older studies from the 90s that she might respect. Monday morning, I turned it in, and she took it without comment, but I saw her reading it during lunch. Wednesday, during our timed writing exercise, Aiden's breathing started getting fast again, and his hand shook as he reached for one of the tap-out cards. He held it up, and Ms. Harrison's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded toward the door. He walked out slowly like he expected her to call him back, but she just kept grading papers. 2 minutes later, he came back looking calmer and picked up his pencil to continue writing. Ms. Harrison watched him for a few seconds, then went back to her work. That afternoon, Jade found me at my locker and asked if we could talk. We hadn't really spoken since the whole video incident, but she said she missed eating lunch together. We agreed to new boundaries where we'd support each other but not do anything that looked like plotting or practicing rule breaking. The next day, we ate together in the cafeteria and talked about normal stuff like homework and TV shows, carefully avoiding any mention of Ms. Harrison's class. Friday morning, I saw Whale's article in the school paper about district technology policies and student privacy rights. He didn't mention our situation specifically, but anyone who knew what happened could could read between the lines about classroom surveillance and recording without consent. A few teachers were talking about it in the hallway, and I heard one say something about needing clearer guidelines. Ms. Harrison started allowing a 1-minute period at the end of class where we could whisper questions about the assignment. It was barely anything but still better than total silence for 50 minutes straight. She stood at the front with her arms crossed during that minute like she was counting down the seconds, but at least we could ask for clarification on confusing instructions. Kids started using those 60 seconds strategically, saving up their most important questions and practicing how to ask them quickly. A month after the whole mess started, I checked my grade online and saw I had a B- in English. The participation penalty still hurt, but the extra credit paper and perfect homework scores kept me from failing. The class atmosphere stayed stiff and uncomfortable, but we'd all learned to work within the new system. Aiden used his tap-out card maybe once a week, and nobody made a big deal about it anymore. Jade and I kept our friendship careful and separate from anything that could cause problems. Ms. Harrison never smiled or acted friendly, but she followed the new rules even if she obviously hated them. Sometimes during that end-of-class minute, I'd hear actual conversation happening and remember what normal classrooms sounded like. The silence wasn't total anymore, but it still felt heavy and unnatural. I kept my head down and did the work, and counted the days until the semester would end. Ms. Harrison turning whisper time into a 1-minute speed-talking game show is peak stubborn teacher energy. Bet she stands there with a stopwatch counting down like it's her personal victory lap over basic human communication. You couldn't win against someone like Ms. Harrison, but you could survive if you played by the new rules and didn't push too hard. Other kids started raising their hands for the tap-out cards during the next few weeks. First, it was just 1 or 2 people per class, but then it became normal to see someone holding up the yellow card and walking out. Ms. Harrison's jaw would tighten every time, but she couldn't do anything about it since the counselor had made it official policy. The stack of cards on her desk got smaller and smaller as more kids kept them in their binders. During a quiz on Romeo and Juliet, this girl in the front row started breathing hard and grabbed a card without even asking. Ms. Harrison watched her leave and then turned back to us with this look like she'd swallowed something sour. The silence in the room felt different now though, less like being trapped and more like we were all choosing to stay quiet together. I saw kids making eye contact and nodding at each other when someone used a card, this tiny show of support that Ms. Harrison couldn't punish. 3 weeks later, I was at the grocery store with my mom picking out cereal when someone tapped my shoulder. Aiden's mom was standing there with her cart full of vegetables and she pulled me into this huge hug before I could even react. She told me Aiden had explained everything about that day in class and how I'd helped him through his panic attack. Her eyes got watery and she kept squeezing my hand while she talked about how he'd been struggling with anxiety since his dad left. She mentioned they were looking into switching him to a different English teacher next semester, which made total sense even if it meant giving up on dealing with Ms. Harrison. Sometimes walking away is the smart choice. My mom asked what was going on, and when Aiden's mom explained the whole thing, she got this proud look on her face. We stood there in the cereal aisle for like 10 minutes while they talked about the school and Ms. Harrison's teaching methods. The next Monday, Mrs. Harrison made an announcement at the start of class about presenting at some district workshop on maintaining academic rigor in challenging times. She had this smug smile while she talked about sharing her innovative silent learning techniques with other educators. We all knew she was just trying to spin the whole mess as some kind of victory for her methods. At least the audio recording of me helping Aiden was gone for good since she needed to look professional at the workshop. She couldn't exactly show a video of a student having a panic attack in her class. During the last week before grades came out, we had a huge test on all the Shakespeare we'd covered. About halfway through, I noticed this kid Gabe in the row next to me starting to freak out. His leg was bouncing super fast and he kept touching his chest the same way Aiden had. I caught his eye and started taking these really slow, obvious breaths while looking right at him. He watched me and started copying my breathing pattern, in for 4 counts and out for 6. Ms. Harrison saw the whole thing but couldn't say anything since we weren't talking or making noise. She just stood there watching us breathe together in total silence, while Gabe calmed down enough to finish his test. We'd all figured out how to work around her stupid rules by now. When report cards came out, I got a B+ in English after all the extra credit work. It wasn't the A I usually got, but considering everything that happened, it felt like a win. My mom sat me down that night and said she was proud of me for standing up for another student even when it hurt my grade. She said the real lesson wasn't about symbolism in books, but about doing the right thing when it matters. On the last day before winter break, Ms. Harrison did something weird and played classical music during our silent writing time. She called it a seasonal gift and acted like she was being super generous. The no talking rule stayed in place obviously, but hearing actual music in that room after months of silence felt huge. Some kids actually smiled while they wrote their essays about winter traditions. The violins filled up all that empty, quiet space and made the room feel less like a prison and more like a normal classroom where the teacher just happened to play background music. Progress with someone like Ms. Harrison came in tiny steps, but at least it was something. Wow, playing Mozart during silent writing time, cutting edge stuff right there. Thanks for hanging out with me and letting me ramble through this little adventure. I'll see you in the next one. Like the video. It helps more than you think.